talk, Raj. I'll be building on some of those things that kind of talked about with respect to templates, but we'll be talking about CT. So I also want to thank the organizers for kind of making all this happen, because I know it's been a little bit of a bumpy ride for a lot of conferences. So my name is John Michelli. I'm an assistant scientist in the Department of Biostat at Johns Hopkins, but I'll be talking about something that's completely applied. It is about creating a high-resolution CT template. So for those who don't work in CT or necessarily neuroimaging, just give a quick breakdown of what a CT scanner really does. So it is essentially an X-ray source that goes around in a circle around a person that's usually laying, I guess, very leisurely. And then there's a detector on the other side, and this thing spins around and you go through it, and more or less at the end of the day, what happens is the detector translates, how many X-rays are going through the object to estimate the density of that object. So more or less, not like MRI where it's, estimating magnetic resonance or anything like that. This is measuring the density of an object. And so on the right-hand side is a 3D reconstruction of a head CT. You should be able to note that there are really, really, really bright areas. That's your skull, which is really bright because your skull is very dense. And the tissue is obviously less dense than your skull. And so you can see some gradations between certain objects there. This is actually a hemorrhage. So this is a patient who had a stroke. And one of the reasons I work in CT is because it is still the workhorse of, clinical imaging, right? So if you go in, you have headaches, or you have a bump on the head or concussion potentially, you're going to get a CT scan. It's fast. It's relatively straightforward. One of the issues is obviously radiation. So that's why we don't have as much healthy control data out in the wild. And that's why I'll talk about this data resource that kind of came online and why it was so important. So again, I'm going to contrast a lot of things compared to MRI, because I think if anybody's working in imaging or neuroimaging, that is what you're probably most used to. So CTs are measured in what's called Hounsfield units, named after Sir Hounsfield, which are, I'll say, standardized. And I put quotes around that because for the most part, if you got scanned at, 2 different hospitals, the outputting image should be relatively similar. It should be actually pretty close in absolute values. So like as compared to MRI, where you go to scanner over here, you might have units in the hundreds, you scanner, across the street, it might have scanners in the units of like thousands. Hounsfield units has standardized units in the sense they are always compared to, they're normalized to what this mu is, which is called the linear attenuation coefficient for water. So pretty much when you see Hounsfield units, it represents like how dense is something compared to water. So things that are water-like kind of fall around like 0. So like the areas of your ventricles and cerebrospinal fluid have areas around 0. And really, really, really not dense areas like air have values of like -1,000. So again, bone will have really, really high intensities. Like around here, you'll have units in like the thousands. Air out here will be like -1,000. Water or CSF will be around 0. Blood sometimes, and more dense objects will have around 30 to 80, but the overall brain will have values between 0 to 100. And that, as long as it's been like properly calibrated and properly set up, that's going to be no matter what CT scanner you go in the world. I mean, there is going to be some variability, but for the most part, they'll be the same across people, which is really important because as many of us who've worked in MRI know that like standardization of intensities is a huge issue. When you're working in fMRI, that standardization is kind of taken into account by the linear model that you use for like task, or that you're using correlations for resting state. So I think Raj talked about the desiccant atlas, but I just wanted to go over what is kind of like a template or an atlas in neuroimaging. Again, the most popular out there is the MNI template from the Montreal Neurological Institute, and that's for MRIs. So usually what it is a population average. And what else? The second thing that it does, it defines a space. So it defines a coordinate system. So that X, Y, and Z actually kind of mean something, or they're at least transferable across studies. So when you say like an X of 81, Y is like 90, Z is like 30, like other people can load up their template and say, oh, that's the region they're talking about. And one of the most important pieces of having a template is having labels or atlases, like the desiccant atlas that says, here's where the amygdala is, here are where the ventricles are, here's where like the hippocampus is, here's where the structures are of the image. Because many times, especially when we're doing any analysis, we want to say, what area is affected or what area is connected if you're talking about connectomics. But a lot of this is really built for MRI. So I wanted to do one for CT, but I needed some data out there. So again, most of the data out there in neuroimaging with respect to CT is really clinical data. And that's problematic because there's a lot of sharing issues. It depends on how they were consented. So there was this really landmark paper that came out in 2018 that had like over 300,000 CT scans analyzed, which is an astronomical number in this field. So they were a group out of India, and they were doing convolutional neural networks to try to identify pathology. And if you go to this website, headstudy.cure.ai, there is a data set called the CQ500. So one thing I'll note here is if you look in this little corner, there's a box that tells how the data is licensed. So one of the really important things, I'm a huge proponent of like open data if possible. This is a data set that's actually licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share, like international license. Why do I tell you that? It's because a lot of times when we work with data, especially out in the wild, it is either not licensed, or we don't know the license, or it's licensed under a restrictive thing. Like a lot of these challenges, you can only do one thing with this data set. This license allows us to create things as long as we give attribution to the original authors, and as long as we're not using it for commercial purposes, we can take this data, remix it, share it, distribute it, and work with it, which is really important if you're doing education, short courses, any of that kind of stuff, or if you're trying to create something for the community like I'm doing here. So what is the data set itself? So it's actually 491 scans with 193,000 slices and an indicator for pathology. So really it's actually 491 subjects, and some of them can have multiple scans, but they have just like one session. So they have all these people, about 500 people out there, and they have an indicator saying, did this person have on their scan any blood or hematoma? So sometimes you'll have intraparenchymal, intraventricular, subdural, subarachnoid hematomas. A lot of these can happen because of hypertension, things like that, but blood spilling out in the brain, as you saw in that one slide I showed you. Also, you can have distortions, right? Sometimes people have tumors, sometimes people have like problems, in their brains, and they'll have midline shifts or mass effects, or some distortion in their brain. And also breaks, right? A lot of people come into the ER because they bump their head. Sometimes and a lot of the breaks in this are skull fractures. So out of the 491, 222 of them had no indication of pathology. So this was done by 3 different radiologists. And then as a subset of those, 130 of them had a high resolution scan and a thick slice scan. So if you look at the cake over here, you can see thin or thick slices. And when I talk about a thin slice scan or a high resolution scan, I'm talking about in the Z direction. If you're slicing the head like this, it will have a resolution of 0.7 millimeters or less, right? So a lot of the stuff in MRI will be high resolution throughout. CT is a little bit different due to the way they reconstruct the scans or take the scans or reconstruct them for radiologists to look at them. But 130 of them had this criteria where the Z-axis was 0.7 millimeters or less, and we picked one of them. So I picked one of them and said, this is going to be the starter for my template. So we'll see as we go on, that's not going to be as important, but I picked it because it had a resolution really close to 0.5 by 0.5 by 0.5 millimeters. So I want a template that's isotropic. I want all the voxels to have the same size dimensions, and then also I want them to be cubes. So I don't want it to be like 0.5 by 0.5 by 1 or something else like that. So if you've never worked with brain images, voxels are essentially 3D pixels. And that's the like kind of smallest unit of measurement in a brain scan. So we picked this one template. We have it resampled to a cube. So we have an entire big image, and now we have fine-grained little voxels in there, and now we're going to create a template from that. Now, before we create the template, I'll say one of the downsides of using this data set, there's no demographics. So I don't know the sex, I don't know the age, I don't know any other information about these people. I don't know any clinical information. I don't know why they came into the hospital. There's no site information, right? To get 300,000 scans, no matter where you are, you're not getting that from one hospital. And even 500 scans that they amalgamated, it's not clear if it's from one hospital or a number of hospitals. There's nothing problematic with this, but the entire population is from India. So it's not clear whether the generalizability of this population and the brain structures, how wide or pervasive. Like, for example, if every single person in this data set I used was like 32 years old and then, right, the generalizability of this template might not be as good. But for the most part, across the world, CT scans look pretty much the same unless there's some, specific underlying disease that's affecting a population. So although this isn't as problematic, it would be nice to be able to do sex-specific or age-specific templates. So really quickly, long and short of it, if you know nothing about this entire talk, I know I have like 4 minutes left. This is what we did. So we have images over here. We estimated a transformation. So how do you register these images to this template? And we get an estimated transformation out, which is an entire like 4-dimensional map. So it's a warping function from this image to this template. And then once we have all these registered up, we average all those images together voxel-wise to get a smooth population map. Also, all of these transformations, we average those together. We multiply this by some small gradient step, and then we apply that multiplied gradient times this average transformation to this average, and we get a new template for the next iteration. So at the long and short of it, this is a gradient descent algorithm that's trying to estimate the true population map. So we do this over and over and over and over and over again, and then we have to define some ways for convergence or determining if we're kind of close or good enough. So what are those two measures we said? Are we good enough? Is it converged? So we use two measurements, which is one's called the dice score, which if you have a 2x2 table, it's 2 times the true positives divided by 2 times the true positives plus the false negatives and the false positives. I think, it excludes the true negatives. I apologize, that's not supposed to be like that. And the true negatives are essentially everything outside the head, right? So the way we actually compare them, we take iteration K and iteration K minus 1, and we can say, how much has the template really changed? And if a dice score of 1 says they overlap completely, a dice score of 0 says there's no overlap. And that pretty much is getting us at the shape of the image. So saying like, is the shape really changing? We looked at the root mean squared error. We took image 1 minus image 2, took the root mean squared error, and that'll give us an idea if the intensities are really changing. So this slide is telling us pretty much the algorithm did reasonably well. The dice goes up as the iterations go on. So pretty much we get to some solid state of the template, and the root mean squared error goes below about a value of 2, which is low because CT scans are measured in integers. So the best we're going to do is maybe get below a 1 Hounsfield unit difference between the two templates. So pretty much we chose one of these templates here, template number 37 in the iterations, and we said that's pretty much the average template we're going to get. And this is the resulting template. So we see here it's relatively smooth. We do see some areas here, which I'll talk about in the next slide, but you should be able to demarcate some gray matter areas and structures in there. So it actually gives a reasonably smooth estimate while also being able to see some anatomical differences. So instead of taking the voxel-wise average, we took the voxel-wise standard deviation because I think this is a good map to show where the variability of registration occurs and where the variability in the intensities are. And some of these really bright areas here are due to some calcifications in some of the images. But this kind of says, some lighter areas here says areas near the ventricles or these sulci is where actually there's a lot of variability there or more variability, and that is due to, just brain differences and also some registration errors. So this slide shows that I have all the code to create the paper is on my website. The templates, if you click there, everything is used in R. I heavily use this package called ANTSR to do all the registration and the averaging and all those types of things. So if you use R, everything's built in that. It also has Python adaptations, but I didn't work on that. So just to stop for 1 second, that's the overall talk. We made a template, we released it. Now the template is great, but you know, if you don't have any atlases, if you can't say where areas of the brain are, it's not as useful. So all I'm saying here in this slide is we took some data out there that was labeled. We registered those brains to this template and averaged the results to get us a estimate of what structures are where in the brain. So we were talking about atlases at the beginning of this and last talk, and this pretty much results in a labeled map telling us what areas of the brain are what. So for example, here and here it might give us like a label that says this is the lateral ventricle. They're broken down by the left and right, talking about the putamen, you know, putamen, globus pallidus, other substructures of the brain. Those are now labeled. It might not be the best labeling, but it's a good start, because if you tried to segment this thing on your own, it's really hard to see the demarcations here. And so at least gives you an idea of where you're looking at in the brain if you find like a brain tumor or a, you know, a hematoma. So we also did a tissue class segmentation to say what's white matter, gray matter, and CSF. Yep. So, okay. And then we also said, you know, instead of just giving like the actual structures, maybe we just want some more gross anatomical features, like where's the CSF for the cerebrospinal fluid, you know, where are the ventricles, where's the white matter, where's the gray matter. So again, if you look at these aren't perfect, but they're a good starting point, I think, for some analyses. And then many times in analysis of CT data, because, you know, you're not working on MRI, you don't have nearly the contrast you do of a T1 weighted image. People want to identify some structures like the lateral ventricles, so we provide a map of that as well. So really, you know, that's great. I think it's great to have a template out there, whatever. But I think the applications for this that are really exciting are deep learning, right? So one, the final dimensions of the image is 512 cubed. And the reason that's important is because image sizes and patches and all that kind of stuff is good to have a multiple of 8 for the way the architecture is for GPUs and deep learning, especially convolutional neural networks, which we're doing a lot in imaging and especially in the TensorFlow framework. Most CT scans by default are 512 by 512. Again, that Z direction is a little bit different, but this fits kind of directly in there. Also, it's isotropics and it's a cube, so you can resample it down to smaller sizes, especially that's especially important when you're doing deep learning, because some of these things have memory limits and stuff like that. But you can have varying levels of resolution and it still stays like a cube, and it's easy to go back and forth. And again, it's released under the same license. So take home messages, there is a template out there for CT. There is maybe only one other one that I know of in like the entire literature of research that's been publicly available. So I wanted to make one that was accessible to people. And, you know, I know this is about a conference about uncertainty. So at best, I would say that the standard deviation image gives you an idea of the uncertainty, but really the idea is this is about a processing step that'll allow us to get into more detailed analyses with CT data to be able to explore what we can find in that space. All right.
Thank you, John.